again. So Sam's thesis is written in the same way that Tamara Sears explained Kristen's thesis, having been written between two departments. It's interdisciplinary. The other department is that of Russian and East European languages and literatures. And Professor Emily Van Buskirk was the other advisor. And Sam came to this, I think, in part through a seminar that he took with me and my colleague Susan Sidlauskas on intermediality. And so saying that, I'll add that Sam likes to say that he's new to art history, but the fact is that he's been engaged with images and of history for some time. Here at Rutgers, he's completing a double BA degree in history and French. Notice no art history in that. You will be, well, that he might as well have. In 2017, he earned a license 3 in photography at the Université Paris, number 8. I need to know more about that designation. He has interned at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Manna Contemporary, the Zimmerli Art Museum, and this summer, he'll be at the photography department at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Next year, he will begin his MA studies in art history at the University College London. These interests and pursuits already seem diverse, but they are brought together by one fact: Sam is deeply engaged with photography. His honors thesis uses the medium, along with the key concept of post-memory, to reconcile his American identity with his parents' origins in the former Soviet Republic of Moldova. The photographs generated by this investigation will form the content of his solo exhibition titled Secondhand Vision, opening at the Manna Contemporary on, write it down, June 1st. Please welcome Sam.
In 1866, the Swedish-born photographer Oscar Gustav Rylander produced this humorous portrait depicting a young girl posing next to a painting of her great-grandmother. The title identifies the sitter as a young Miss Constable, though the dual meaning of the image's alternative title, Family Likeness, exposes its twist. For the young girl sports the same white bonnet, lace shawl, and black dress as her relative depicted nearby. The description of this image as one of family likeness attests not only to its subject's genetically based resemblance, but also to the deliberate masquerade, staging, and likely darkroom retouching that contributed to its making. This album in silver print alludes to the apparatus of family history, memory, and identity in a way the artist probably didn't anticipate. Though, an article of the period published in Art Journal credits the, quote, fertility of Rylander's imagination, close quote, for this rather unusual portrait. And indeed, Rylander continues to gain traction in the museum world today. He is frequently being posited as the father of art photography. Stage photography has gone through a rocky and much criticized history, only to reemerge in the 1960s, flourish in the postmodern period, and after the digital term. Let My Own Photograph, produced 152 years after Rylander's, attest to the fact that artists have been performing for the camera since the medium's introduction in the 19th century. These artists, actors, and storytellers transform themselves into colorful characters. They construct elaborate sets and use green screen technologies, and they manipulate their photographs to meticulously construct fictions. The photograph you see here on the right is part of a larger body of work I'll be presenting to you this evening. It features, perhaps surprisingly at first glance, my 16-year-old sister adopting the role of an elderly ancestor as part of a fictional family album I've been creating for the past 8 months. My talk tonight is thus going to be split in 2 parts. In the first half, I'll present 2 out of 3 bodies of work that will comprise my interdisciplinary honors thesis and will be part of a solo exhibition at Manna Contemporary, Jersey City this June. I'll then attempt to place my work in its art historical context by taking a look at how artists have reenacted global, familial, and art histories for the camera. Over the course of this thesis, I made an effort to connect with the culture I inherited as the son of Soviet Jewish immigrants from Moldova. Following the theory of post-memory, I am part of the so-called generation after that inherited a cultural heritage indirectly through photographs, stories, and behaviors at home, yet still continues to identify with it closely. In this first series, Secondhand Vision, I turned to my personal collection of family photographs spanning over a century. And this is my father, who is standing right over there. I restage and reimagine them using surrogate devices such as masks, mannequins, and miniatures, and antique photographs as stand-ins for long-gone relatives. In these untitled reenactments, I am forced to project my own imaginings, experiences, musings, and ideologies to reperform moments from their lives. I then engage in an otherwise impossible dialogue across space and through time, between pixel and grain, from ancestor to descendant. And in doing so, I turn the tables around, becoming an immigrant myself, a fictional voyager to a constructed, subjective representation of life in the former Soviet Union. And those are my parents again. The final image of the series is a self-portrait in which I cropped out my face and digitally inserted it into the camera lens. The photograph itself is a reflection in the mirror. And the series is actually ongoing, as if it can never be finished. And I'm currently recreating several more traditional mantelpiece sort of group portraits, which will be on view at MANA in June. Now, in secondhand vision, I got to know the people of the Soviet Union, but not so much the places where my parents grew up. Now, the term Mother Russia is just as fictional as the landscapes photographed in this next series of the same name. It is a generalized cultural label intended to describe the origins of immigrants from the former Soviet Union and their descendants. The series follows the travels of a fictional relative who is an amateur street photographer. The work opens up with the images of Soviet life in the city, as well as the country. But there are also images of Soviet popular culture and myth, such as these photographs of the USSR's secular Santa, Father Frost. Next, you see this fictional relative going through the immigration process, at first to New York. Some of you may recognize this institution. And then to Israel. And I hope that one day I will be able to break out beyond the artifice of the world in miniature form and visit some of these sites for myself. Now, the second half of my presentation will be a brief overview of the chapter in my thesis titled Encore, Reperforming History Through the Photographic Lens. The Australian historian Greg Deaning wrote that we never know the truth by being told it. We have to experience it in some way. That is the abiding grace of history. It is in the theater that we know the truth. Photographers have been producing theatrical images reenacting history since the mid-19th century, and their subjects range from global and political histories to personal or family memories to the history of art itself. I considered the works of 21 artists whose photographs date from 1858 to the present under three superficial categories that I proposed: resurrection, projection, and correction. Of course, nearly all of the works I'm about to present span more than one category, but these labels are intended to serve as organizational tools. By reperforming the past, artists inevitably resurrect historical figures, scenes, and environments. Historical figures from all centuries are suddenly reanimated, and long-deceased relatives reunite with their living descendants. Approaches to photographic resurrections, however, are remarkably diverse. Let us begin with personal or familial resurrections. We've already seen Miss Constable's take on reenacting family history. In his series, I Am My Family, the Chilean-Canadian photographer Raphael Goldchain restaged photographs of his Polish ancestors. The artist takes on the roles of numerous relatives himself as a means of mourning, remembrance, and laying claim to a particular family lineage. The British artist Gillian Wearing also turned to family albums to resurrect relatives and even younger versions of herself, using hyper-realistic silicone masks to stage virtually identical copies of the original photographs. And like Goldchain, she takes on all of the roles herself. Ethiopian artist Aida Moulinet resurrects women from vintage Ethiopian photographs, but reimagines them in ultra-modern futuristic portraits. Other artists resurrect recognizable icons. Rylander bore an uncanny resemblance to the Italian revolutionary general Giuseppe Garibaldi, depicted here on the left. Between 1895 and 1898, the Boston photographer F. Holland Day staged nearly 250 photographs reenacting moments from the life of Christ, in which he played the title role. As a pictorialist, this was a way to engage with a subject long depicted in the history of Western art, and thus a means to establish a place for photography within this history. The images, however, were criticized as blasphemous, and Day was accused of homosexuality and being a moral degenerate. In 1999, the Japanese artist Hiroshi Sugimoto produced the Portrait series, in which he photographed wax likenesses of renowned individuals at Madame Tussauds. By turning the photographic lens towards these lifelike surrogates, Sugimoto reanimates such individuals as Fidel Castro and Princess Diana so effectively that it almost seems as if they posed for the artists themselves. And he photographs other historical figures in the series as well. In fact, he calls himself the first 16th century photographer. Greta Pratt and Benjamin Norman photographed well over a dozen Lincoln reenactors, exploring the visual culture behind American iconography and myth, as well as the relationship between individual and cultural identity. And this just came out in Time magazine, I think the other day. More recent icons of African and African American history are depicted in Samuel Fasso's African Spirits series, in which the artist restages specific images these celebrities are associated with, using his own body as a canvas. Many artists reenacting history for the camera assert authorial presence and artistic agency to cast their own interpretations and imaginings onto historical narratives. The photographers discussed in this next section project themselves into histories that they never experienced and flesh out what could have been. Some project themselves into foreign cultures. In the 19th century, Orientalist photographers staged fictional and inaccurate photographs reenacting daily life in the Islamic world, a culture with which only a small but growing number of Europeans actually had any direct contact. Others imagined what life might have been like for their ancestors, such as Emily Matias, who reenacts her immigrant grandmother's first years in America and travels to Romania to experience the life of a Romanian villager herself. Libohan Kaganye dons her late mother's clothing to insert herself into old family photographs. Jamie Dimond hired actors to reenact moments from her childhood. Rie Yamada detaches herself from her own family and instead projects herself into strangers' family snapshots. And finally, it is worth noting those artists who reenact history in order to correct it. These artists produce self-portraits that confront traditional notions of racial misrepresentation and seek to correct whitewashed histories. In His Story of Man series, Segana Jose reenacts portraits of white men from antebellum America, including a newly elected Lincoln, a much more complex figure than that appeared in Pratt's work. And these photographs are striking. The artist's gaze is direct and piercing, his body language is rightfully confrontational, as the black photographer reclaims power over men who would never have permitted him to be photographed in the first place. The Indigenous Canadian artist Merrill McMaster confronts misrepresentations of Native culture by American photographers and painters. And finally, the Korean-born, London-based artist Chan Yo-bae engages in an artistic overcorrection by appropriating the most recognizable symbol of the culture he hopes to become a part of, the British monarchy. But I want to end here, at the very first image that I presented to you from Secondhand Vision, which depicts a faded 19th century daguerreotype I purchased on eBay. I wanted it to appear as though the artificial family I've created managed to preserve a single photograph from the 19th century. Instead, I discovered that my $25 purchase was only affordable because the original image had faded. But what's funny is that it doesn't matter whose likeness was once depicted on the other side, only to make it into my hands however many years later. Erasure is a fate that awaits almost every photograph, both analog and digital. Photos fade, files get lost or deleted, and humans fade even quicker. So what's so special about this little daguerreotype? The plate the image was developed on now functions as a mirror. In an effort to find someone from the past, I'm left looking only at myself. Thank you.